And get started with a big old welcome and a thank you all so much for being here. Obviously, on this very snowy morning, I am in Lexington. I don't know where you're coming from, but I know that we are seeing lots of snow and ice out there, and it seems like we made the right decision, even though it was a hard one to not be able to be with you all in person today. But we are thankful that you're joining us online. It looks like we have 55 attendees, which may be better than we had for past whole conferences that we hosted online. So thanks y'all for being here. We do have a few announcements that we wanted to kind of get started off with. Even though we are not able to have our conference in person, I did want to share my screen very quickly and just say thank you to our sponsors who did support us for our conference this year, although of course the weather has sent us home. We are very thankful for your support, especially KEA. They were a top sponsor 2 years or maybe even longer. So thank you all so much for your support. We just want to give our sponsors a little bit of space for all they've done for us over the years to continue to keep this content working and keep us doing the jobs that we're doing. The next thing I wanted to announce, if the computer will allow me to, is that we are also, today is the day that we are launching the application process for our Summer Policy Institute. I will be posting lots of different links in the chat throughout this call. And then if you would like additional information, we can also we will be sending out plenty of information about the Summer Policy Institute. But this year, our Summer Policy Institute, in its second year, only in its second year, we will be at Berea College. We're excited to go to Berea, where KyPolicy is housed. So we're not in the college, but at the city. So July 28th through the 31st, we will be at Berea College with 12 to 15 college students, and we will talk about how the state budget and tax systems affect citizens, how to use data to advocate for policies that build a thriving future, policy issues hindering and helping Kentuckians, and the legislative process. We had a really amazing time last year at the Summer Policy Institute, and I was going to play this little video just because it's very cute, and we're really thankful for the people that put it together. But last year, our students were able to interact directly with policymakers, ask their questions, learn about all the different types of employment within policy, and of course, the policy itself. So we're really excited about SPI this year going to Berea. Again, that will be at the end of July 28th through the 31st in Berea College, and we are accepting applications as of today. And again, I will post those links in the chat as we go along during today's presentations. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I think, oh yes, just a few little disclaimers. If you would like to ask a question, we do have a Q&A. The Q&A is available for you to ask those questions as they come up, so you don't have to wait till the end. We will have plenty of space for questions at the end of the conversation as well. Let's see here, questions. We are recording today. I do plan on getting this up on our YouTube page by early next week, if not later today. And let's see. I think those are the big announcements that I had. Again, we will, between presentations, I'll mention the Summer Policy Institute again, and I will post those links again. So without further ado, we did, for this presentation, we will have two presentations. We're going to talk about the budget first with Jason Bailey, and then we'll go over to Kaylee Raymer, our criminal legal system analyst, and Adrienne Bush is with us from the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky to talk about HB5. So Jason, I'll hand it over to you, and thanks y'all so much for being with us.
All right, thanks, Natalie. Good morning, everybody. Really glad to be with you today. We are sorry not to be in person in Lexington, but still wanted to try to do a shorter session on a couple of just really pressing issues, as Natalie mentioned. And the first one that I'm going to cover is the budget, the state budget. Big debate going on. We'll go on the next couple of months about creating the next 2-year budget. So this is, as you're probably aware, is just a cornerstone issue always of these even year legislative sessions. The budget itself, it's not easy or exciting to read. It's a bunch of numbers on a bunch of pages. But we want to start not with that, but with sort of what it means and what it can do. And you sometimes hear that a budget is an expression of our values, or it's the ultimate policy document. And it really is probably the most powerful tool we have together as Kentuckians, the state budget, to create a more just and more prosperous Commonwealth. And a budget is ultimately about resources and about a vision for our communities. So we want to start with just a little exercise to get some of your thoughts out about where needs are for resources in your communities or that you've noticed to build a better Kentucky. So Natalie has just dropped a link to minty.com in the chat. And if you could click on that link, and it's going to ask you a question. And the question is, for you to identify one thing that you think your community or your family or Kentucky as a whole needs more resources for. And this question, you do not need to be an expert on budgets at all to answer this question. You just have to have lived in the world and observed things in your community or through your own experience. So just think about one thing, or you can enter multiple ideas, but at least one thing that you think your community or Kentucky or your family needs more resources for. If you could, I'll be quiet for a minute, let you plug those in. Yeah, there should be a link there now. Okay, great.
Of course, it was. We always have some kind of fumble. Thank you all. Jason, we have answers coming in. Would you like me to share my screen?
Sure, that'd be great.
It's kind of fun to watch it.
Popping up. There we
Yeah.
go. So I'm seeing a lot of people put the word housing in there. I'm seeing a lot around education. Affordable housing also is big. Childcare, transportation. Wow, you have a lot of ideas. 130, 140 responses now. Public education, mental health support, mental health resources, substance abuse, food security, paratransit, homelessness. So this group was able to answer this question pretty easily. It looks like lots of ideas, lots of things that you're aware of in your community that there are needs for. And we're going to drop, Natalie, if you could drop the link to this in the chat so people can take a look at that as we continue the conversation. And if you could unshare your screen. There we go. Going to share my screen. And we'll go a little more into the budget and into this tool. So a budget is really a way to address many of the things that you all have already identified. It's this kind, I think of it sometimes as this kind of invisible thing that flows through our communities and touches all of our lives in ways that are really important, but we often do not understand or recognize, where the money comes from. 1.5 million Kentuckians receive their health insurance through the Medicaid program, which is funded by the state. That's about 1 in 3. 600,000 Kentuckians at any one point are in our public school system, and many of us were there at one point. A couple 100,000 in higher education at any one point. And then there are adults who've experienced that in their lives. About 500,000 Kentuckians receive food assistance through the SNAP program, which is administered by the state. 300,000 Kentuckians receive clinical services through the public health departments last year. 46,000 acres of state parks. There are just lots of ways in which we use the state budget, rely on the state budget, and it has a big impact on our economy and our quality of life. So how does this tool work? At a really high level, we collect taxes and other revenue from within the state. And then in the current year, that totals about $33 billion from all kinds of sources. And then this state spending in many cases is necessary to leverage and pull down federal money from Washington. And we leave money on the table, frankly, every year in Washington because we don't maximize what we can bring. That adds another $19 billion in federal money. And so the total is about $52 billion this year. So just to put that in context, our entire economy in Kentucky is about $250 billion annually. So $52 billion is a lot. And so it really impacts us in lots of ways, especially when you consider the kinds of services and investments that it goes to that just aren't provided necessarily through a private market. So the tool has a lot of potential to be a way that we can better thrive. And as there's been a lot of gridlock in Washington the last couple of decades, I'm sure folks are familiar with, like it or not, the state level has just become increasingly important in terms of whether we make progress or we move backwards on very, very important issues. The extent to which this tool is effective really depends on, I think, a couple of things. One, does the tax and revenue system ask more of those who have more? So is it based on ability to pay, including things like graduated income taxes, corporate taxes that don't have loopholes, maybe higher property taxes for those with greater wealth and so forth? Or is it based more on the taxes and revenues that everyday people pay, like regressive sales taxes on consumption of everyday needs, or fines and fees that hit those people harder who have less? And second, does it reflect the needs and priorities of our communities? And does it provide the funding levels that reflect what communities actually need? And you all create a vision this morning of ideas and priorities that this group of people on this call have identified. Is that kind of vision driving of a better Kentucky for all, driving where the resources go and the level of resources provided? Does it provide adequate and equitable access to quality public services? So that's kind of a little bit of background on what the budget is. I want to turn now to the recent history and see what's been going on now leading up to and including the current budget that's now under debate. So the last 30 years have not been great for our budget, especially the last 15 years. And a few things have gone into that formula. One is that after the legislature passed significant tax increases associated with the Kentucky Education Reform Act in 1990, which is when after the state Supreme Court ruled our system of school funding unconstitutionally inadequate and inequitable. They raised taxes and investments went up. But shortly thereafter, the legislature began to pass a more aggressively pass a series of tax breaks. And over the years, it's included a lot of things, corporate tax incentives of various kinds. We've eliminated our estate tax, cut the inheritance tax, eliminated tax on banks. It's been little cuts here, cuts there that have undermined to a certain degree our revenue base. And then 15 years ago, the Great Recession hit our economy, hit the entire country and the world, in fact. And we had just had a very slow recovery from that. And it took over a decade to recover the lost jobs. And by that time, it was about the time that COVID hit. So the combination of those factors and other things led to budget cuts. We had about 20 rounds of budget cuts after 2008, and just led to a severe reduction in service levels, loss of employees to provide services, and state workers didn't get raises for 10 of 12 years, and we saw this disinvestment that's happened pretty severely. So very recently, though, we have had the opportunity to begin changing that. Nearly all states saw strong revenue growth the last couple of years, despite the fact we hit a recession in COVID. And why is that? Well, because Congress, unlike during the Great Recession, really did its job in providing pandemic aid. So we had expanded unemployment benefits, we had an expanded child tax credit, food assistance, child care assistance, there was a pause in student loan payments, stimulus checks, and so forth to help people through the process of job loss and economic downturn that occurred during COVID. And as they spent that money, as folks spent that aid, it multiplied in the economy and created jobs as we began to reopen. And we had a very fast recovery and got the lowest unemployment rate we had in 50 years. As that happened, it also increased state tax receipts pretty significantly. We also had temporarily high inflation during the pandemic as we had global supply chain backups that increased prices. That also pushed up receipts. But the bottom line is, after fairly modest revenue growth and even revenue loss during the Great Recession, we saw 11% growth in 2011 and 15% growth in 2015. And that's not just been Kentucky. It's nearly every state that has experienced this level of growth. But for our state, in terms of our budget and what the legislature has chosen to do, they've largely not appropriated those increased funds. Every year since 2021, which is when those revenues started getting much higher, the legislature spent far less than it was bringing in, over $1 billion per year less than it was bringing in, as opposed to sort of years where they had to scramble to try to even pass a balanced budget. The opposite is happening now. There's more coming in than they are spending, and they are holding down spending pretty significantly. So where did that money go? If it didn't go into spending, where did it go? The answer to that is it went into reserve funds, what's called in our state the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. Sometimes it's called the Rainy Day Fund. Throughout most of the last few decades, as we've again had those tax cuts and other issues, we haven't had very much in that fund. Most folks would say you need about 15% of an annual budget in a rainy day fund. That's a really good rainy day fund. We haven't had near that for most of the last few decades. But now we're beginning to have, and we're actually beyond having the opposite problem of sort of stockpiling too much money in reserve. So we blew past that 15% benchmark of a really good rainy day fund a couple of years ago, and we're now at about 24%, so $3.7 billion sitting in those reserves. And it's on track by this summer, which is the period right before the new budget goes into effect. It will climb up to about 36% or $5.6 billion sitting in those reserve funds. So that's more than double what we need to prepare for the next economic downturn or prepare for any emergencies. We're just stockpiling a tremendous amount of money in that budget. So that presents, or in that reserve fund. So that presents the new budget that the legislature is creating. They're creating a 2-year budget, as they always do, with a really important opportunity. There is money there. And there is both one-time money, so there's money that's already built up in that reserve fund, that $5.6 roughly billion by this summer. There's one-time money you could spend on sort of one-time expenses like school building construction or housing construction or water and sewer infrastructure, as well as sort of recurring money, over $1 billion a year that they're not spending, that they haven't been spending, that's been building up in reserves that could go for ongoing, recurring things, whether that's teacher raises or expanded childcare subsidies or other mental health services, other needs as well. So there are important opportunities in this coming budget to do more than we have been doing and begin to reverse some of the trends that we've seen. So the bottom line is the money is there for a budget that delivers this legislative session. And the question that looms over the session, I believe, is will the legislature rise to that challenge and that opportunity? We'll talk about the process for a bit. So the budget is a piece of legislation or multiple pieces of legislation. The governor proposes his budget, as does the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in terms of how their branch of the government would like to spend their money. But then it's ultimately the legislature that passes a budget. The governor can veto and can line item veto, where he crosses things out, but the legislature can override his vetoes with a simple majority, assuming it gets back, they pass it in enough time. So the legislature really decides this. Last week, or rather this week, the governor presented his ideas back in December. This week, we got the House budget, at least the first version of the House budget. It will go to committee and then be voted on the floor in the House. Then the budget will go over to the Senate. They will unveil their proposal. It will go through committee and through that chamber. And then it will be reconciled through a conference committee, ultimately what's called a free conference committee of lawmakers from both chambers who will come up with the final product, likely around the beginning of April, send it to the governor, who can then veto, and then they would vote to override the veto. So that's sort of the process that's in front of us in the next couple months. But the first step, or really the first step in the legislature, was this week when the House passed or introduced their draft budget. And the bottom line of that budget is it really continues the trend that we've seen, where it doesn't really rise to the occasion of the revenues that are available that have gone up in recent years, and appropriate additional monies to use what's available and begin to reverse some of these trends we've seen in budget cuts over the last couple decades. One area where that's really glaring, I think, is in the area of K-12 education, where the core funding formula for public schools is called SEEK, and it's the main funding mechanism for the school systems. It's been declining, not been keeping up with inflation ever since 2008. And as this graph shows, in the House budget, in the governor's budget, it actually begins to reverse. It doesn't make up all the ground that was been lost since 2008, but those light yellow bars on there show that under the governor's plan, you'd see a pretty significant jump back in the opposite direction. But on the House budget, the kind of erosion continues. The total SEEK funding would drop from 26% below 2008 levels down to 30% below by the end of the biennium. There's not a dedicated teacher raise. There's small amounts to go into the SEEK formula, but it would not be enough to provide a significant raise, especially since we've seen teacher pay fall behind inflation, about $10,000 behind where they were in 2008 statewide on average, because of the cuts in state funding. It increased, but still does not fully fund school transportation. Somebody put that in the budget vision document. The state law says that the legislature will pay 100% of the cost of school transportation. They haven't been doing that since 2008. It still doesn't do that in this budget. Funding is flat for preschool, for extended school services, and there's no funding for professional development and textbooks. So the education budget, I would say, continues the current trend for the most part of sort of eroding state funding. There are other areas of the budget. There are a few bright spots, I would say, particularly regarding Medicaid slots for people with disabilities, of which there is a waiting list of about 12,000 on that waiting list. There's about 2,500 new slots, which is quite good. And there's good money in here, significant money for to match federal infrastructure dollars. That's an important new opportunity that states need to take advantage of. There's really massive pension liability contributions in here, which we have a lot of pension liabilities, though they'll only be paid down over through consistent funding over a long period of time. Certainly putting extra helps, but this is a lot of money, and the question is, what are you not doing in the short term to do that? But there are just a lot of other, even beyond education, I think, areas where there's some deficiencies. If you look at childcare, for example, we've been losing childcare centers over the last decade or more, and there's been federal pandemic money, about $330 million a year, that's been propping up those childcare centers and stabilize the industry to a significant degree. But states have to, that's ending. And so states have to pitch in their own amounts. And this would only include $40 million, which is really not enough to stem the decline that we're seeing. There's no money for housing in this budget. There's a proposal from advocates for a couple $100 million for housing. No additional money for the Eastern Kentucky disaster cleanup. There's not a cost of living adjustment or any kind of payment for retirees, which they haven't had any kind of such COLA since 2011. There is a raise for state employees, but basically keeps up with inflation, and no money to deal with kind of these wage compression issues, which the governor had proposed, where people have been in state government or for a long time are not making a whole lot more than newer employees. And so there's a need to address that in order to retain people better. Not really a lot of progress in rolling back these post-2008 cuts that I talked about, for example. There is some more money for higher education, for example, but they're still at 26% below 2008 levels. And there's just some areas that just don't receive funding that need it, like additional money for public defenders to deal with their caseloads. The operating aid for libraries was cut in this budget. And there's not any sort of visionary new initiatives that could be launched and begun when you're talking about the kind of resources we've built up. Many states are doing things like a state child tax credit that could really reduce child poverty. We don't see that. The governor is proposing universal preschool. There's no more money for preschool in the House budget. So we just don't see the kind of scale of resources or investment that matches the scale of resources. So what then happens to the money if they're not really, again, rising the occasion? What happens? Well, it's a continuation in part of the trend that I talked about earlier, where the Budget Reserve Trust Fund just keeps growing. So it's $3.7 billion today. It will grow to about $5.8 billion in the House budget. So they just continue adding to it. And so what we will have, if a budget like the House budget gets enacted, 36% of our budget in a Budget Reserve Trust Fund by the end of the period. So why is the legislature putting so much money into reserves at the same time these long-standing needs, or even in some cases really urgent needs, are not being met? And I think one answer to that, which has been the process underway recently and seems to be where some folks want to continue to head, is toward this kind of three-step process where you enact really austere budgets, even unnecessarily austere with the resources that are available, stockpile the reserves, and then use that funds and potentially more for tax cuts, really picking up and much more aggressively cutting taxes compared to what we saw a few years ago, or back in the before the Great Recession. So the way that the legislature started to do that a few years ago is create a formula with trigger mechanisms that they say gives them permission to cut taxes by saying that we can afford it. And it cuts the state's 5% income tax by up to 0.5 point a year. And it's based on kind of a 1-year snapshot of your revenue and your spending. It has kind of two parts. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but basically how much is in the reserve fund. You have at least 10% of your budget in there. As I said, we already have 24%, so they've already met that trigger. And the second is that are you spending less than your revenues by more than $1 billion a year? And under that formula, the first cut automatically went into effect from 5% income tax to 4.5% on January 1st of last year. And then the conditions were met for reduction from 4.5% to 4%, which started just a few weeks ago. So we went from a 5% to a 4.5% income tax, and now a 4% income tax. You can see on this graph on the right, we had a top income tax rate of 6% for almost 100 years, 80 years, starting in 1936 during the Great Depression, excuse me. They lowered it to 5% in 2018, and then this trigger mechanism has begun to bring it down from 4.5% to 4% the last couple of years. So pretty rapid decreases in a short period of time compared to many, many years when this was a cornerstone of how we funded the public services that we have. It's increasingly difficult the more you cut to continue to cut because, as I'll show in a moment, income tax is a pretty large revenue source. So the trigger was actually not hit in this year to go into effect next year. So they did not hit the trigger this time around. One thing that seems pretty clear in terms of the House budget is that there's going to be an extra effort to try to hit the trigger in the new budget. And one of the ways it does that is just change the rules. So there's this one trigger that has to do with how much is spent, and they put the budget into a part of the budget into a separate bill this time, and say that certain infrastructure and other appropriations in that bill just don't count toward the trigger. So the idea of the trigger, I suppose, is that you've shown that you can keep spending down so you can afford to cut. But under what they're doing in House Bill 1, they're just saying, well, we're just not going to count some of our spending, about $800 million, and kind of move the goalposts on that and say they don't count. They're also putting about $1 billion more in debt than the governor had proposed, borrowing for things when there's billions in cash available, borrowing for them, which it means that it's not a big expenditure in the current budget. It's spread out over a long period of time and actually costs more because you're borrowing, but also helps hit the trigger. So they seem pretty determined to hit the trigger. And, the goal, which is in the law now under state law, is that they will continue this process until the individual income tax is completely eliminated. And it's important to understand that, almost every state has an income tax. There's only about 8 states that don't. In Kentucky, it provides 41% of our general fund revenue. So it is our largest source, our single largest source. Nearly half of the budget is paid for through that individual income tax. The effort and what is in law is to continue this trigger mechanism every year until that is at zero. So we would completely eliminate our income tax. No state has ever done that except one, which is Alaska, and they did that only after they struck oil and got oil revenues. But the process has begun in Kentucky to begin to try to get to that goal of completely eliminating our largest source. These cuts are really, really expensive because, again, if you're talking about 41% of your state budget, even a 1-point cut costs a lot of money. It's about $1.4 billion to cut by a single point, so to go from 5% to 4%. And that's more than we spend on all of post-secondary or higher education. It's about half of what we spend, a little over half of what we spend on the entire Medicaid program, which I mentioned covers 1 in 3 Kentuckians with healthcare. And it costs a whole lot more than things like universal preschool or what we spend on mental health and behavioral health. So it's really, really expensive. It's about double what it would cost to create a child tax credit, which I mentioned earlier, that would cut child poverty in by 25% in Kentucky. So these are small cuts to individuals, but they're really expensive to the state budget. And I think one of the things you will hear from proponents of sort of continuing to introduce the income tax is that will grow our economy, that businesses will want to come here, people will want to come here, we'll be able to replace the lost revenue from enhanced economic activity. That is not working out so far. We're 1 year into this experiment of reducing the income tax through these triggers. We had 10.9% growth in the income tax the year before. We've seen since then income tax drop by 4%, so roughly a 15% decline from the trajectory that we had before so far, and that's before this new cut went into effect January 1st. So we're not replacing the revenue. What we're seeing is less revenue as a result. And there's just a question of how far the legislature will go. Again, the goal in law is to get to zero. But each cut is harder, each cut is more expensive. And there's some experience of this. Most recently in Kansas, about a decade ago, Kansas took this approach of saying we're going to rapidly reduce our individual income tax, and it's going to be a shot of adrenaline in the heart of the Kansas economy. It's going to spark a lot of economic growth. And our budget will be fine as a result. Kansas didn't find that to be the case. They had to make massive budget cuts. They had to in the school year early. One year they had a court ruling that their funding was unconstitutional. They had credit downgrades, and they had to roll it all back 5 years later. And in Kansas's case, the cut was 11%. It was 11% of the revenue that they lost as a result of their income tax cuts that they had to roll back, and they created this crisis. In Kentucky, so far, we've cut 4%. So going down from 5% to a 4.5% income tax, that's a 4% loss in our total revenue. We just went down another half point. That's 8% once it's fully eliminated or fully implemented. And then you can see as the rate continues to go down, 3.5%, 3%, 2.5%, we pretty quickly surpass what Kansas did, and it's a bigger cut than what Kansas did. Now, right now, the economy is good. The economy wasn't so great in 2012 and 13. Kansas was doing this, and that was part of what happened there. But we know that good times don't last forever. Recessions come, and we will be far less prepared to enter that recession, deal with the harms if we diminish our largest revenue source. The benefits of cutting the income tax, if that's the top budget priority, really go overwhelmingly to people who have more. It's not a lot of dollars to the typical person. So this just shows how much a 1% cut in the income tax is in terms of dollars for people at different income levels, starting with the bottom 20%, the poorest 20%, going up to the richest 1%. For, a working class person makes $30,000 a year, which many people do in Kentucky. It's about maybe one cell phone payment a year it would help with. But if you're in the richest 1%, you're getting 100 times that amount of money. So it's really skewed in that way. It doesn't help about 1 million low-income Kentuckians who are exempt from the income tax by a low-income credit that was created decades ago. And it leaves out about 85% of retirees because we don't tax a lot of retirement income. So the beneficiaries tend to be those people who have more. And another way of looking at that is that about 2/3 of the dollars go to the highest income 20% of people. And you can see that the top 1% get 20 times more of the dollars from an income tax cut than do the poorest 20% of Kentucky. So it's pretty skewed in terms of when we make a choice to cut income taxes in this way, we're choosing to send resources to these folks in this way, and we're choosing not to do some of the things that I mentioned earlier that we may want and that we may need to do to deal with longstanding budget cuts that still have not been reversed, or new crises that may emerge, like the end of the child care funding or the housing crisis that's in front of us now. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask Natalie if there are any, I haven't been able to look at the chat or whatnot, but if there are any questions that I should take a look at or respond to at this point.
I'm checking. Oh, we just got a couple of new ones. We had a few that we've been able to answer thus far, but we just got a couple of new questions that came in just now. Let's see. Thank you for explaining the very complex topic so clearly. Just trying to understand. One of the trigger rules is that the state spends less than it takes in by $1 billion. Is that correct? What happens to the excess billion? Does it roll over to the budget reserve trust fund?
Yeah, great question. So I think I said it was about $1 billion. It's really a 1%. It's the amount equal to a 1% income tax cut, which is about 1.3 billion. Is another way to per year it goes up every year, but that's the amount that they would have to spend below what they receive in revenue. And to answer the second part of your question, yes, it goes to that budget reserve trust fund. At the end of the year, whatever's left over that they haven't spent after everything's been appropriated and spent, and there's any sort of what's called necessary government expenses, whatever's left over goes into that budget reserve trust fund. And that's why we have 3.7 billion in there now, whereas for many years we didn't have. We had very little, is because they are underspending to try to hit these triggers.
We had a couple of questions about where we could find information. So one is, if we wanted to read the budget bill, is that available on the General Assembly website? And then another question earlier on asked about where we could find these numbers. I'm not exactly sure exactly what numbers they were asking about, but I think that we could probably roll both of those into where do people find this information
Yeah.
as far as the budget itself?
Yeah, so we can put the link in the chat to the legislature's website is legislature.ky.gov, and there is actually a page on there called Budget Bills that includes all of the budget bills. It's more than one bill. The main House budget is House Bill 6, and so you just have to look under bills for House Bill 6, but we can put the link to that. And then I would also just point folks to our website because we do have an analysis of the House budget as well as an analysis of the governor's proposal. And then we did a preview report, maybe to the question about numbers and stuff. We did a budget preview report in December that sort of laid out the context leading into the budget that also is on our website that provides some of what I also talked about today.
So I know that, Jason, you mentioned in your presentation that Alaska is the only state to completely cut their state income tax. The question here, is there any state who has reduced their income tax and succeeded in balancing the budget?
Well, I think there are a lot of states that have sort of especially in the last couple of years because of this extra revenue that's coming in for the reasons that I talked about. There are some states that are doing what Kentucky is trying to do. They're phasing these in. They're using these trigger mechanisms. And so the short-term effect, just like in Kentucky, is not there yet, right? Because they're being phased in over time, and we're not seeing huge budget cuts yet. But the more people go down this road, and when the economy is no longer, 4% or less unemployment rate, you're going to see them struggle. I mean, somebody asked about Tennessee. I mean, there are some states that have never had an income tax, but in all cases, there are a couple things going on there. One is that they either have a really large tourism economy, like Tennessee does, like Florida does, and like Nevada does, or they have a lot of natural resources, like Alaska, like Texas, like Wyoming, and they generate revenue that way. The other thing they do, because the income tax is such a robust source, is they have higher other taxes. Tennessee has a much higher sales tax. They have higher property taxes. They have much higher business taxes than we do. And I don't see any will in the legislature to increase our business taxes, our property taxes, or even our sales taxes at this point. There were many years where they talked about shifting from income tax to sales tax, but they don't talk about that at all now. They're just talking about cutting the income tax, I guess, under the assumption that we don't need the money, or that the economy will, again, like the growth fairy, I guess, will come in and wave her wand, and we'll have enough economic growth to make up for it, or I'm not sure what, right? But it's really changed the conversation in recent years. But I would argue that nothing has fundamentally changed about our economy. We're just in a really unique situation right now nationally, where we've had a stimulus from pandemic aid that has created extra revenues that are just not going to last, especially if we continue to cut.
I'm going to put a couple of questions together about where we can find information. And I'm afraid the answer is just going to be KyPolicy.org and other organizations like us. But the question was, what is the best way to compare and contrast proposed budgets with prior year's budgets, and what agencies really want? And then he came back again with, how do you find out what individual state agencies want for their budget, and what is the proposed budget?
Yeah, so in terms of the proposed budgets, well, I don't think there's an easy, from the first question, I don't think there's an easy way to compare different budgets. One of the reasons we exist is to try to break that down and analyze that to the extent we can. But there's not sort of a state resource that sort of compiles and compares. In terms of the agency requests, and the governor's request is sort of, I guess, representative of the entire executive branch, which sort of works for the governor. So that's probably the clearest way to look at what they're asking for. There are also agency requests, which I believe are in the document that is on the governor's website and the Office of the State Budget Director. It usually is, that includes some of what the specific agency also requested. And you can also find certain agency requests on other websites like the Council for Post-Secondary Education, et cetera. So that's how you can look to what they're asking for. And then, you know, in the case of the Chief Justice and the judicial branch, that's also filed as a piece of legislation what the judicial branch had asked for in terms of their budget.
There are several other questions, but I do want to kind of move us along just because we are trying to get out of here by noon and we have a second presentation. So if you want to keep adding questions to the list, we will be responding with an email after this call. Several people have asked, and I will go ahead and say that the email will include the links that we have mentioned, links that we will continue to mention, and we'll try to get those slides out as well. But Jason, of course, I'll give you the last word. I do have in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and press enter, that there is a letter available right now that you can sign and ask your lawmakers to stop the foolishness and allow us to patch the budget that delivers for all Kentuckians. That is at KentuckyTogether.org. That's a coalition of groups that KyPolicy is part of, that we're all asking for our government to deliver for us. And so that's KentuckyTogether.org/hashtag-letter. But that link is also in the chat. And again, after this call, we will send out an email. It might not be till Monday that you get it, but it will include the recording of this, the links that we mentioned, and we'll try to answer these questions individually between now and then as well. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I was just going to mention exactly that, the Kentucky Together letter. I think it's important that, well, decision makers know what folks' thoughts are, their constituents' thoughts are about the budget, their priorities, and what direction they want to go in. So really do encourage you to fill out that letter and share your thoughts. And thank you so much for the opportunity to listen to me today. And I will hand it back over to Natalie.
Thanks, you all. Again, please do continue to ask these questions. We will try our darndest to get those answered for you individually at the end of this call. If we do not get well, we haven't gotten to them right now, so we will try to answer them individually. So I would like to ask Kaylee, Raymer, and Adrienne Bush to come on camera if at all possible. We are so thankful to have both of you on. As many of us know, our issues all overlap. We understand that when something happens in the budget field, it interacts with the criminal legal system. And when something happens within the criminal legal system, it can often overlap with housing and different issues that people are facing. And so we are very happy to have on the call today Kaylee, and of course my dog, and Kaylee Raymer, our criminal legal system analyst, and Adrienne Bush, the executive director of the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky. So thank you all so much. I will go ahead and go on mute myself and just hand it over to you all.
So Kaylee has done a great job with the overarching bill, House Bill 5. I am planning on covering the sections that address homelessness and housing, but I think for an overarching view of HB5, Kaylee has a great deal of expertise. But I can talk about specifically the housing and homelessness sections, and maybe Kaylee can chime in afterwards with all of the other criminal and civil issues that are raised by this bill. Okay, so the anti-homeless and housing provisions contained within House Bill 5, much of the material and the sections I'm going to cover today are derived from the Cicero Institute, which is a recently conceived and founded group out of Austin, Texas, founded by a venture capitalist. And I'm going to put a link to their website here in in the overall chat here in a minute. So they've basically spent quite a bit of time attacking evidence-based methods of addressing homelessness, improving housing security. Over the past few years, they have really shifted their strategy to promulgating copy and paste legislation across states with similar political conditions and dynamics between cities and state governments as to the conditions here that we see in Kentucky. Here, with this version, they rolled the copy and paste sections into the larger omnibus bill that has been prioritized by House Republicans. While the ostensible goal of the bill is to improve public safety and not necessarily address homelessness, with their inclusion, the bill will nonetheless impact Kentuckians who are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. So we're going to go through a couple of sections. Section 17 bans unauthorized street camping. So what does that include? It includes tents, it includes huts, temporary shelters, and it includes vehicles. It also includes cots, beds, sleeping bags, hammocks. And where is unauthorized camping prohibited with this bill? On a public or private street, sidewalk, area under a bridge or underpass, path, park, or other area designated for use by pedestrians or vehicles, including areas used for ingress or egress to businesses, homes, or public buildings. This is when the area has not been designated for sleeping or camping, and or the individual lacks authorization to sleep or camp in the area. The punishments that come with a charge of unauthorized street camping is with the first offense, which is considered a violation, potentially a $250 fine. The second or third or fourth or fifth offense, ad infinitum, it would be considered a Class B misdemeanor, which would also carry a $250 fine and up to 90 days in jail. So when we talk about where street camping, unsheltered camping would be banned, we're basically talking about everywhere. It doesn't take into account rural counties where there are no shelters. It doesn't take into account the lack of shelter beds or shelters at full capacity in towns and cities where we do have such resources. The lack of family shelter across the board, or rational decisions made by people who are unhoused around safety, pets, public health, or household composition that preclude people from accessing shelters. An additional consideration here is that the Supreme Court has decided to take up a case that is called Grants Pass v. Johnson, originating out of Oregon. This session, they are going to hear arguments about it. This will set precedent on whether governments can criminally punish people when inadequate or no shelter options exist. Section 18 was amended in the House Committee Substitute, which was heard in House Judiciary Committee yesterday. So just a bit of process note, we had the original bill introduced on January 9th, and then it was assigned to the House Judiciary Committee this week, very recently. And then the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing after the House adjourned yesterday on this bill. And so they adopted what is called a committee substitute. It is the latest version of the bill. The original version would have required the use of any funding flowing through Kentucky designated for permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness to require behavioral and rehabilitative elements. Essentially, that people could not access any sort of permanent supportive housing unless they went through a prescribed treatments or sobriety programs or whatnot. Essentially, it would bar housing first oriented programs from receiving federal and state funding. Currently, the General Assembly does not appropriate any money towards permanent supportive housing. As it was initially filed, it would have jeopardized $79 million in federal funding across Kentucky. Domestic violence shelters were explicitly carved out from the provision. However, we know that many survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual assault enter the system or end up in programs that serve the general homeless population, so they would be subject to these requirements. We worked diligently to have the sponsors amend this language to remove the financial risk to federal funding and align the behavioral health requirements more with current best practice. So this is the current language in the bill. Notwithstanding any statute, administrative regulation, or common law to the contrary, appropriations from the general fund, any restricted fund, or the road fund shall not be expended by any state or local officer, official, employee, or agency for any initiatives to provide permanent housing to homeless individuals if those initiatives lack behavioral and rehabilitative requirements. So what has been struck is the provision, the clause on federal funding. Behavioral and rehabilitative requirements shall at a minimum include requirements that the initiative, that the program, facilitate appropriate treatment of any mental health conditions or substance use disorders and prohibit criminal activity. So from the Homeless and Housing Coalition Kentucky's perspective, we're relieved to see the removal of federal funding from this section. We also recognize that the requirements for programs to offer access to behavioral and rehabilitative requirements are already a critical component of housing first oriented programs and are more aligned with evidence-based strategies and how programs are currently operated. However, this section is still unnecessary and grounded in misinformation about the catalyst for unsheltered homelessness and housing insecurity writ large. That is a severe shortage of housing, particularly for extremely low-income Kentuckians. While there is overlap between the homeless population and those experiencing mental illness, it is not the primary cause for homelessness. It is best met with housing with services, which is what Housing First is. Homelessness has not been and will not be solved by behavioral health requirements at the individual level. Moving on, Section 19 authorizes local governments to create a designated camping zone with potable water and portable toilets, but it provides no funding to do so. A couple of comments here. Camping sites are expensive. For what it costs, cities could facilitate actual shelter. It implies that it is a best practice intervention. Generally speaking, it is not. Permanent housing is. It requires that these camps be placed in commercial or industrial zones away from any public area. So away from services, away from service providers, connections to schools, other family members, etc. And right now, as it stands, cities do not require explicit permission from the General Assembly to do this. Louisville has implemented a safe camping place, the Hope Village. Seeing how that is working out, knowing that we have so many unsheltered folks and there aren't enough shelter beds to go around, but this is not anything that they required permission from the General Assembly to do. Additional sections we are concerned about that are housing and homeless related, they're not part of the Cicero template. Section 21 expands the stand your ground components of Kentucky law to include people unlawfully street camping as a justifiable defense for violence. While Kentucky courts liberally interpret this clause already, this further stigmatizes people experiencing homelessness as potentially violent criminals when evidence indicates that people who are unsheltered are more likely to be victims of crime, not perpetrators. Sections 10 and 11 further criminalize rental damages, thanks to Senate Bill 11 from a few years ago, which we fought for 3 sessions. Rental damages now fall in the misdemeanor category if they are over $1,000. This bill moves the threshold back to $500. The same arguments that we had in 2019, 2020, and 2021 still apply. It doesn't account for security deposits, which are running about $2,500 across some areas in Kentucky and for some populations. It conflicts with jurisdictions that have adopted URALTA, the Uniform Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, and it further stigmatizes renters, not valued people in our communities, but potential criminals. I did skip over a section that I just realized, and that was going back to section 20, and this is part of the template Cicero stuff. It would require local governments to explicitly enforce the provisions of the unauthorized street camping, and the Attorney General could bring suit if they did not. So, with that, we continue to oppose this bill. We have some calls to action out. I will get my act together with the chat or Q&A and get this information out to folks. And with that, I'll turn it to Kaylee.
Thank you, Adrienne.
Thanks, Adrienne. So as Adrienne mentioned, this is a large bill, so I'm going to talk about some of the other provisions. She's just covered the housing ones. And I just want to note, though, that we won't be able to talk about the entire bill. We do have a full analysis of the bill as well as a link to the actual bill if you want to read those after the webinar. So let's go ahead and jump in. One second. I hope my screen share is working correctly. I'm new at this. So before we talk about the bill specifically, I do want to just do some level setting. There are people here who are probably criminal legal system experts, and then maybe some that are not. So what's going on in Kentucky in our criminal legal system is, if we were a country, we would be the 7th most incarcerated place in the world. And what that looks like is this. We have a large number of people in jails and prison. On this graph, that's the blue. And then we have an even larger number of people under community supervision. So that's probation and parole. So these are folks that are living among us in our communities, but they are still having to report to probation and parole officers. They live in this fear that they could be sent back to jail or prison. And to further break that down, this is what's happening in our state. We have about 32,000 people in jails and prisons, an additional 63,000 on probation and parole. I will add these are the 2022 numbers, so they are slightly outdated, but you get the picture. And more than half of people in our jails are there pre-trial. That means they are presumed innocent. They haven't been convicted of any crime. They haven't pled guilty to anything. They are there awaiting trial or resolution of their case simply because they can't afford to post bail. And for many people incarcerated in our state, the most serious offense is a drug possession charge. And also, incarceration is incredibly expensive. We spend $722 million this year on corrections alone. So that's just to give you an idea of what this is costing us. And that's just corrections. That's not local police. That's not our jails. So this is just one number. All right, so now that we've leveled, let's jump into the bill. I'm going to talk now about the increased fentanyl provisions in the bill and why we believe that they're likely to lead to higher overdose rates in our state. I imagine that most everyone on this call is aware of the overdose crisis in our country and in Kentucky specifically. So obviously, this crisis is why these provisions have been brought. Kentucky has among the highest fatal overdose rate in the country. The overdose deaths in our state did decline in 2022 overall, but they rose among Black Kentuckians. And even though we saw that decline, we still saw over 2,100 people lose their lives to overdose. So a decline, but still a significant number of people are dying. And fentanyl is present in the majority of overdoses, over 70%. However, our laws related to fentanyl are already harsh, and they've been made harsher as recently as 2022 when the legislature upped the parole eligibility for fentanyl-related offenses. So what's this bill do? Well, it makes the penalties even harsher. It includes what we call drug-induced homicide. And what that means is if you traffic fentanyl to someone, they consume it, and then they die as a result of the consumption, you can be charged with murder. So you're looking at 20 years to life in prison. And this is concerning for a lot of reasons, but one is that our definition of trafficking is very broad, and there doesn't have to be money exchanged. You could just share it with someone who then dies, and you could be looking at a murder charge. And specifically, if no payment is exchanged, you're looking at manslaughter in the second degree under this bill. It also increases penalties for fentanyl trafficking by 1 level. And this is a little complicated, so I've just left it general. There's more details in the analysis, but the level or the time you're looking at in prison, it depends on how much fentanyl there is. It also increases penalties for promoting contraband. And what does that mean? Contraband is basically something you're not allowed to have in a jail or prison. So drugs, for example, but contraband is also a lighter, or could be a knife or something like that. So if the contraband is fentanyl, you're now looking at 10 to 20 years. If it's any other kind of contraband, 1 to 5 years. This used to be a misdemeanor. Now we're looking at felonies. So why is all of this problematic? Well, increased penalties have led to increased overdoses in other states. It can also disrupt the drug supply in some pretty dangerous ways. And then related to the drug-induced homicide provisions, the sponsors of this bill, who do they want to target with this drug-induced homicide? They want to get these large drug kingpins who are trafficking fentanyl into our communities and killing our people. And that's understandable. However, other states have passed similar laws, and that's just not what this does. What it does is it gets people who are low-level drug users, maybe low-level dealers, who usually know the overdose victim. Those are the people getting charged with murder. So communities that are already grieving, already struggling with substance use disorder, are further victimized by drug-induced homicide laws. An example, in New Jersey, 25 of the 32 drug-induced homicide prosecutions they had, the person was a close friend of the overdose victim, not a drug dealer. So we're very concerned about that. We're also really concerned that this will scare people away from calling 911. If you're in a room with someone, they're experiencing an overdose, and you know that calling 911 might result in you being charged with murder, you're probably less likely to do that. So those are some reasons these provisions are problematic. Now I'm going to move to some of the sentencing enhancements in this bill. There are a lot of them, so I'm going to cover a few that are particularly terrible. A little level setting again for everyone here. Our General Assembly loves to enhance penalties and create new crimes. At KyPolicy, we track this. We've been doing that since 2011, and that's what this chart shows, that this is how many penalties they've increased versus how many penalties they've reduced, and it's significant. And this bill is on track with that behavior. So there's plenty of research out there about sentencing, and the research tells us that longer sentences don't reduce crime, violent crime specifically. They don't deter people from committing violent crime. Research also tells us that the general public is pretty much unaware of sentencing details. So if you're asked the person on the sidewalk, you know, what's the punishment for wanton endangerment first degree, they probably don't know, right? So there's also less of a shock value when we take these already really long sentences and make them even longer. We also know that people tend to age out of criminal behavior. There is an age range where we see a lot of criminal activity among certain groups, and people age out of that. So we'd be paying to keep folks locked up long after they really pose a threat to our communities with these lengthier sentences. And then, and perhaps most important, violent crime is down in Kentucky, and around the country. It did rise during the pandemic, but it is coming down. So this bill is not a response to some crime wave that's happening in our state, and that's important to keep in mind. So what's the bill do? Well, here's one thing that it does. There's a 3 strikes provision in this bill, and many of you have maybe heard of 3 strikes before, and yes, it's a baseball reference. 3 strikes and you're out. And House Bill 5 says that if you have 3 violent convictions for violent crime, you're looking at life in prison or the death penalty if that last offense is eligible for the death penalty. This is concerning for a lot of reasons. One reason, though, is that Kentucky already has enhanced penalties for repeat offenders. We have what's called the persistent felony offender law. It's incredibly flawed and problematic, but it's really unclear how this would work with that. Would it stack on top? So we already have a mechanism to kind of do what this provision seeks to do. And 3 strikes laws aren't new. They were enacted at the federal level, have been enacted in many other states since the 90s. So a lot of research has gone into their effects, and the researchers have found that they don't reduce violent crime. They're really expensive to implement. They take discretion away from courts and judges who can make decisions about sentencing, and they disproportionately harm communities of color. Still talking about sentencing enhancements here, we have to look at the violent offender statute in Kentucky. This bill will expand the violent offender statute. And I know we say violent crime just kind of in our everyday conversation, but the legal definition of what is a violent offense is really important. And the reason is parole eligibility. And so what that means is if someone's convicted of a violent crime, that means they have to serve 85% of their sentence before they see the parole board and can maybe get released early on parole. So if you're sentenced to 10 years for a violent crime, you're not going to see the parole board until you serve 8.5 years. Other non-violent offenses, they have different parole eligibility. Most commonly 20%, some are 50 and some are 10. It just earn 15. It just depends. But Kentucky already has a pretty broad violent offender statute. It's literally a law that lists all the crimes that qualify as a violent crime. House Bill 5 wants to add some more to this list. Some examples, they want to add wanton endangerment, specifically in the case of a drive-by shooting, carjacking, which would carry 10 to 20 years in prison. And a side note, this is important because carjacking sounds scary, of course, but I want everyone here to know that carjackings are not going unprosecuted. We already have laws that we can use to prosecute carjacking, in particular, robbery in the first degree, kidnapping, maybe assault. So this is creating a law that we don't really need, a new crime that we don't really need. House Bill 5 also wants to add fleeing from the police to the violent offender statute, and I talked about it earlier, promoting contraband. This bill will also expand who's eligible for the death penalty to include anyone who causes the death of a first responder while in the line of duty. Okay, and like I said, I can't get to everything in this bill, but I do want to cover a couple other provisions that are important that we want to highlight. And one is that this bill creates a new crime for parents who have a child in juvenile court proceedings. So their child's been charged with some kind of crime. It says that parent, if you don't come to court with your kid, you're looking at up to $500 fine and or 40 hours of community service. This may sound reasonable. Parents should go to court with their kid, but the problem we foresee is that this is going to really disproportionately impact low-income parents who maybe work hourly wage jobs. They don't get their schedule ahead of time. There are transportation issues. And also, many judges already require or order a parent or guardian to attend court proceedings. A lot of juvenile courts won't even do anything on a kid's case unless an adult is present. And judges have what's called contempt power, meaning if they order you to show up and you don't, they can punish you. They can put you in jail for however long, they can order you to pay a fine. So this is really unnecessary and could be pretty harmful. Another provision, this bill would greatly restrict charitable bail funds. So what it does is it says, hey, you can't post for certain types of offenses, violent offenses, and some others. It also says that they can only post less than $5,000 bail for people, and they have to keep certain records and share them with the legislature. This is problematic in a lot of ways. One is that the definition of what a charitable bail fund is really broad. The way it's written right now, it could apply to churches who raise money to try to get someone in their congregation out of jail. It could apply to a family who sets up a GoFundMe for their loved one's bond. And the big picture here is this further sends a message that if you can afford to buy your freedom, you get to be free. But if you're poor, you have to stay in jail. And we have great problem with that. And then finally, I'll talk about the expansion of shopkeepers' privilege. This says that if you're in a store and shopping and the owner or worker at that store suspects that you are shoplifting, they can use reasonable force, which is not defined. They can use reasonable force to detain you until the police arrive. And this also says that the person who uses that force, they cannot be sued civilly. So let's say you're injured in whatever force they use, you can't sue them to recover for your medical bills or your lost wages. And it also says that they're immune from criminal liability, meaning they're not going to be charged with any crime. Our concern here is obviously we don't think that people should be able to use that kind of force against folks. We're concerned if someone's stealing a bag of chips, are they going to be shot? Are they going to be assaulted and then have no recourse? And then obviously, this could impact certain groups that may be racially profiled unfairly while shopping. And finally, Adrienne talked about the vandalism provision a little bit. So the only thing that I will say is that this provision does allow folks who have money and that can pay for the damage that they allegedly caused or fix the damage to get a misdemeanor instead. So it says that if you have those resources, you're entitled to a misdemeanor, but if not, you're looking at a felony. And that further creates this disconnect between those who have money and those who don't. So I don't want to leave on this depressing note. So I did want to highlight some things that do make us safer. This bill is full of ideas that we know research and evidence tell us don't work, but there are things that do work. Generally, investing in more affordable housing and education and community-based services that folks need, such as mental health services, and increasing access to harm reduction supplies will help our overdose crisis. And harm reduction supplies, for example, fentanyl testing strips, new syringes that folks can use. And then more specifically, some things that our legislature could do. Fund housing first models, as Adrienne talked about. Let's get people into safe housing, and then let's focus on if they have mental health issues, if they have substance use disorder, and get them the help they need. But first, let's get them into warm and safe housing. Also, they could reform our Good Samaritan law. This law says, hey, if someone's having an overdose and you call the police, you're not going to be arrested for having drug paraphernalia or drugs on you. But in practice, police often show up, run people's names, take them in for warrants, charge them with trafficking. So folks are scared to call the police. We could easily fix that by reforming this law. And finally, the last two things, something we could do is expand our expungement in the state so that when people get out of jail and prison, they've served their time, they can truly start with a clean slate and they don't have the weight of this conviction following them around for the rest of their life. And then finally, we can give folks IDs when they exit our jails and prisons so they can more easily access services. And I'm sorry for my dog making noise in the background. Okay, and this may have been shared in the chat already. I can't see it, but if you're on your computer, you can scan this QR code with your phone. It'll take you right to our Action Network campaign. Takes less than 2 minutes. You just fill it out. It'll send in a message to your legislators telling them to oppose this bill for all the reasons that I've discussed before. And we greatly appreciate you all tuning into this section. I'll also add that on our UnLockKY site, we are going to be updating as this bill moves through the process. It may change a little bit. And so if you want to check back in there and sign up for updates, we will keep everyone posted.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. If you can, oh, there you go. But also, please come back on camera so we can take some questions. Thank you, Adrienne, for also being with us. And generally, thank you all both for all of the information. It is a huge bill. I think that one thing that was pointed out last night when it was in committee was just the general size of the bill makes it really difficult. When you have something so huge, it's unlikely that every single concept in that bill is going to be positive. And so thank you so much for trying to get us as much of the information as we can. There are lots of different links within the chat. Again, we will send out a lot of different links after this call as well. So one question, the first question, I know that we may not be able to answer, but I think we might as well try. And I know that we also have some other experts on the call. So if anybody thinks they can answer, why does HB5 exclude school-based law enforcement agencies from receiving critical crime-related information? I don't have an answer for you, but I just wanted to open that up if anyone else had anything that they may be able to add to that conversation. I don't have an answer.
That is outside of my area of expertise. I don't know.
Natalie, this is Pam. They did change part of that in the committee substitute so that the law enforcement officers that are employed by the school district can get the information as well.
Okay. Thank you, Pam. So it sounds like that has been updated. The shopkeeper's privilege, how will it play out if there was no shoplifting and someone is hurt? My guess is that's not addressed. So the question is, with the shopkeeper's privilege, it does allow for reasonable force. If someone is mistaken and is harmed because the person working believes them to have stolen something, is there any recourse within this bill for that person who has been harmed?
Yeah, the answer is no. So it doesn't matter if they were actually shoplifting or they weren't. The shopkeeper is protected from any civil or criminal liability. So that's one of the biggest issues, is that folks may be doing absolutely nothing wrong, could be injured, and they won't have any way to have any recourse for that.
I believe the bill sponsor kind of answered the question in the presentation yesterday about, like, well, at that point it's up to a jury.
Yes.
And that is not helpful when someone has been violently injured or killed, is my comment on that.
Thank you, Adrienne. One anonymous attendee would like to hear more about the role of Cicero Institute and similar efforts in other states. If you all could speak on that.
Sure. So Cicero was founded by a man named Joe Lonsdale, based out of Austin, Texas. In 2016, they tried, they successfully had some legislation passed in Texas and decided to expand their playbook. So to date, a similar bill, similar provisions have passed in Missouri, put a pin in that, and have been introduced in Georgia. Some other anti-homeless provisions bills have passed in Tennessee, not necessarily aligned with Cicero. But this year, Kentucky has Cicero elements in this bill. It's my understanding that Indiana, our neighbor to the north, also is dealing with this in their session. And it is, going back to the Missouri case, or the Missouri law, it turned into a case. So the legal services groups in Missouri filed suit after it passed very quickly, and kind of in the dark last year. And it most recently, the state Supreme Court has it has put a stop to it, has overturned it, but based on procedural reasons, because it violated the Missouri Constitution's requirements that bills be of a single subject and that it be germane. It had originally started out as a bill about unified local governments and counties and such, and then, of course, during a committee substitute process, the model language from the website appeared. So we will see how that plays out legally, but I would point folks, if you are interested in learning more about how this type of legislation affects rural communities, the Washington Post has done some really great journalism as to how this has played out in Springfield, Missouri. And the too long didn't read version is just, there are no places for people to safely be in public. People are constantly shifted around, and it has not actually connected people to permanent housing. And it's just made everyone's lives harder, most especially the people who are experiencing homelessness.
Thank you, Adrienne. I think we have time for just maybe one or two more questions. Is there a relationship between HB5 and an effort to develop a prison in Letcher County? I don't believe so, but I don't know the answer. So
I don't know the answer to that question. I will point out that the proposal for the prison in Letcher County, it's a federal prison, so that's a federal initiative, whereas this is a state bill. But I would be surprised if there wasn't some connection between the people who are at the table making those decisions. Our colleague Ashley, who is not a panelist today, does a lot of work related to stopping the federal prison in Letcher County, and she could follow up with a better answer to that question.
all right, thank you, Kaylee. I want to, let's see. We've gone through a lot of these. All right. I think there's some questions on Cicero and Alec, but I don't believe that we are all the experts in that area. Let's see. All right. So thank you all so much. I do believe we are really close to noon. I will just talk for a few more minutes. If there's any additional questions y'all want to put in the question answer, we would appreciate it. I will be sending out an email to everyone who attended today with our slides so that those can be shared out, a link to the video for this event that we are recording currently, and all the links that we have mentioned. There are lots of places for people to get involved. There are lots of different action networks. I appreciate Michael for mentioning that, you know, the Madison County Tenants Union also has its own link as well. So there are groups working across the state on these issues and so many more that we will try to give you all as much information as we can after this call. But I want to see if there's any other question that we can answer right off the bat, and I'm not seeing any right now. But thank you all again so much for being with us. We appreciate your time, and I want to leave our panelists, if you'll have any last things you would like to say as well, I'll leave space for that. All right, not seeing anything. Just thank you all so much for being with us. We will be sending out an email with all this information, and if you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. I will try my darndest to answer them if you've got them. So thank you all so much for being with us. We appreciate you, and I hope that now the sun is out in Lexington, at least. I hope you can enjoy this snow day with your families, and just stay safe out there. So thank you all so much for being with us. Okay.